I looked down at the young man sobbing on the damp grass, then back at his mother's horrified, tear-streaked face, and finally at my dog Daisy, who was trembling in my arms. One question kept screaming in my brain, drowning out the park's distant ambient noise. Did I just become the villain of my own life? How do you explain to a crowd of judging eyes that you didn't have a choice? How do you justify striking someone who the world says you should only ever protect? It started as a perfect Sunday, the kind of day where you feel like you finally found your footing in a new city. But it ended with me questioning every instinct I have as a human being. My name is something I'd rather keep to myself for now, but my story, and the weight I've been carrying since that afternoon in Redmond, is something I need to get off my chest. Seattle has this way of making you feel like you're living inside a watercolor painting. Everything is muted, soft, and slightly damp. I moved here about 3 months ago for a job opportunity I couldn't pass up, trading the familiar, predictable rhythms of my hometown for the constant, low-hanging mist of the Pacific Northwest. It's a lonely transition, if I'm being honest. Anyone who's ever moved to a city where they don't know a soul can tell you that the silence in a new apartment is heavy. It sits in the corners of the room, reminding you that you're a stranger in a strange land. But I wasn't entirely alone. I had Daisy. Daisy is a 5-year-old spaniel, and she is, quite literally, the heartbeat of my life. She's got those long, velvet ears that catch the wind when she runs, and eyes that seem to hold more empathy than most people I've met. She's the kind of dog who doesn't just wag her tail. Her whole body wiggles with a sort of pure, unadulterated joy that makes it impossible to stay in a bad mood. Since moving to Seattle, we've developed this little ritual. Every weekend, I look up a new park on the map, somewhere we've never been, and we take a little road trip. It's my way of exploring the state and her way of smelling every single blade of grass in Washington. This past weekend, the map pointed us toward Redmond. It was one of those rare afternoons where the clouds actually broke, allowing a few shards of pale sunlight to hit the evergreen trees. The park was beautiful. Sprawling green fields, winding gravel paths, and the smell of pine needles and wet earth. I remember feeling a sense of peace as we walked. Daisy was on her best behaviour, trotting along beside me, her nose twitching at every new scent. She's a social butterfly. She loves people, and she loves other dogs even more. If someone were robbing my house, Daisy would probably bring them her favourite squeaky toy and ask for a belly rub. She doesn't have a mean bone in her body. We had been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed an older woman and a younger man approaching us from the opposite direction. The woman looked to be in her late 60s or early 70s, with kind eyes and silver hair tucked under a knit beanie. The man with her appeared to be in his early 20s. He had a somewhat vacant but pleasant expression, walking with a slightly stiff gait. As they got closer, the woman's face lit up when she saw Daisy. "Oh, what a beautiful girl," she said, her voice warm and grandmotherly. She stopped a few feet away, a polite distance, and looked at me for permission. "Could I say hello to her?" I smiled, feeling that familiar pride you get when someone admires your dog. "Of course," I said. "She's very friendly. She loves the attention." The woman knelt down, and Daisy immediately did her little wiggle butt dance, leaning into the woman's hand as she scratched behind those long spaniel ears. It was a sweet, mundane moment, the kind of interaction that happens thousands of times a day in parks all over the world. "She's so soft," the woman remarked, looking up at me. Then she glanced over at the young man standing beside her. "Do you mind if my son says hi too? He's special needs, but he loves animals." "Not at all," I replied. "I've always tried to be an inclusive person. I believe that everyone deserves the joy of connecting with an animal, especially someone who might experience the world differently." I encouraged Daisy to stay still, and the young man stepped forward. He didn't move like the mother did. There was a certain unpredictability in his movements, a lack of the social cues most of us take for granted. He reached out his hand, palm flat, and Daisy, being the sweetheart she is, gently rubbed her face against his fingers. She gave him a tiny, tentative lick, a gesture of friendship she offers to almost everyone she meets. For a second, it was perfect. The sun was out, my dog was making someone happy, and I felt like I was finally starting to belong in this new community. But then, in the blink of an eye, the entire atmosphere shifted. It was like a switch had been flipped in the young man's brain. He pulled his hand back violently, his face contorting into an expression of pure, visceral disgust. "Ew!" he screamed. It wasn't just a loud noise. It was a guttural, piercing shriek that echoed off the trees. Before I could even process the sound, he lifted his foot. He didn't just nudge her or push her away. He lunged forward, his heavy boot aimed directly at Daisy's ribs, his face twisted in a mask of sudden, inexplicable rage. He tried to stomp on her with enough force that I knew, if it landed, it would do serious damage to her small frame. My heart didn't just beat, it hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Instinct took over. I jerked the leash, pulling Daisy back just as his foot slammed into the dirt where she had been standing a millisecond before. The thud of his boot on the ground was sickening. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking with a mix of fear and adrenaline. "What are you doing?" I didn't wait for an answer. I reached down and scooped Daisy up into my arms. She was whimpering, her small body shaking against my chest. I backed away, my eyes locked on the young man. He wasn't backing down. He was staring at me, or rather, staring through me, with an intensity that was chilling. The mother was frozen. She looked like she had been turned to stone. "Oh my God," she stammered, her hands hovering in the air. "I'm so sorry. He's never done that before." "Control him," I snapped. I wasn't trying to be mean, but the adrenaline was surging through my system, and my primary instinct was protection. "You need to get him away from us." I continued to back up, but the young man didn't stop. He was still staring, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on Daisy in my arms. He looked like a predator marking its prey. I told her again, louder this time. "Tell him to back off. He's still coming at us." The woman started pleading with him, calling his name, but he wasn't listening. He was locked in. And then he did something I will never forget as long as I live. He crouched slightly, his arms trailing behind him in a strange, distorted posture, a mix of a Naruto-style run and something out of a horror movie. And then he darted. He didn't just walk, he charged. He was 10, maybe 15 feet away, and he was closing the gap with terrifying speed. I am a bigger guy, a few inches taller than he was, but the sheer unpredictability of the attack, the raw, unbridled aggression coming from him, sent a jolt of pure panic through me. I had Daisy in my arms. I couldn't use my hands to defend myself without dropping her, and I knew if I dropped her, he would go for her again. He was right on top of me. His face was inches from mine, his hands reaching out. In that split second, I didn't think about special needs. I didn't think about social consequences. I didn't think about how it would look to the people sitting on the benches nearby. I only thought about the fact that I was being attacked and my dog was in danger. As he closed the final foot of distance, I reacted. I shifted my weight and delivered a hard push kick, a reflex from years of casual kickboxing classes, straight into his midsection. It wasn't a strike meant to injure, but it was powerful. The force of the kick caught him square in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. He lost his footing and landed hard on his butt in the grass. The silence that followed was deafening. The sound of him hitting the ground was muffled by the grass. But the sound that followed, a high-pitched wailing sob, seemed to tear right through the air. It was a sound of pure, childlike distress, and it hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. 1 second I was a protector, a man standing his ground. The next, I was a guy who had just kicked a special needs person in front of his elderly mother. The adrenaline was still screaming through my veins, making my hands shake as I gripped Daisy tighter. She was burying her face into my neck, her small heart hammering against my collarbone. I looked down at the young man. He was sprawled on his back, his legs kicking out slightly as he cried, his face red and wet with sudden tears. The attacker I had seen a moment ago, the one who had lunged at me with that terrifying, predatory speed, was gone. In his place was just a confused, hurt kid who didn't seem to understand why the world had suddenly turned violent. I looked at the mother. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Her mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. She looked as if she had just witnessed a car crash. Then the shock broke, and her eyes filled with tears. She rushed to her son's side, dropping to her knees in the dirt, her hands fluttering over him like a bird trying to protect its nest. "Oh, honey, oh, sweetie, it's okay. Mommy's here," she whimpered, her voice trembling. Then she looked up at me. That look. I'll never forget that look. It wasn't just anger. It was a deep, soul-shattering disappointment, as if she couldn't believe a human being was capable of what I had just done. And that's when the amped feeling really took over. When you're that scared and that full of adrenaline, your brain doesn't go straight to, "I'm sorry." It goes to, "I had to." It goes to defense. "Why do you bring him out if that's what he does?" I heard myself saying. My voice sounded foreign to me, harsh, loud, and jagged. I wasn't calling her names. I wasn't swearing. But I was demanding answers because I needed to justify the fact that I had just used force. "He tried to stomp on my dog. He charged at me. He's never done that before," she sobbed, clutching her son's hand. He was still wailing, a sound that was starting to draw the attention of every single person in that section of the park. I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel the silent judgment of the strangers walking their own dogs, the couples on the benches, the joggers who had slowed to a crawl to see the commotion. "You said he's never done that before. But how do I know you're not lying?" I shot back. It felt like I was in a courtroom and I was both the prosecutor and the defendant. "I have a right to be safe here. My dog has a right to be safe. You told me he was friendly and then he tried to crush her." The young man's crying got louder and the mother started to rock him back and forth. I was seething, but it was a heat born out of a cold, paralyzing fear. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay? Should I run? If I left, would she call the police? Would I be the guy on the local news who kicked a disabled person at the park? "I want to call the cops," I blurted out. I didn't actually want to call them. The last thing I wanted was a police report and a legal headache. But I felt like I had to be the one to suggest it. I wanted my side of the story on the record. I wanted someone to acknowledge that I was the one who was attacked first. I wanted to be seen as the victim, because if I wasn't the victim, then I was something much, much worse. The mother didn't even look up at the mention of the police. She just kept whispering to her son, trying to calm the storm inside him. Just as the situation felt like it was about to boil over, a woman I hadn't noticed before stepped into the space between us. She was middle-aged, wearing a sensible fleece jacket and carrying a leash of her own. She held up her hands, a universal gesture for calm down. "Sir," she said, looking directly at me. Her voice was steady, calm, and incredibly firm. "You need to take a breath. I saw the whole thing. I saw him go for your dog, and I saw him run at you." The relief I felt at those words was so intense I almost dropped Daisy. Someone had seen it. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't a monster. "But," she continued, her eyes softening but remaining serious, "you don't need to escalate this with anger. It's a bad situation. It's an unfortunate, horrible situation for everyone involved. But getting louder isn't going to fix what just happened." She stepped closer to me, put a gentle hand on my arm, and steered me a few paces away from the mother and son. "Walk with me for a second," she said. I followed her, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. Daisy was finally stopping her whimpering, but she was still buried against my chest, her little body warm and heavy. We walked about 20 yards away, far enough that the sounds of the young man sobbing were muffled. "Take a deep breath," the woman said. "Look at your dog. She's okay. You're okay." I looked down at Daisy. She looked up at me, her big brown eyes searching mine, asking me what was wrong, why I was so upset. I felt a lump form in my throat. The anger was starting to drain out, replaced by a hollow, sickening sense of guilt. "I didn't mean to hurt him," I whispered. My voice was no longer jagged. It was small. He came at me so fast. I didn't know what else to do." "I know," the woman said. "Reflexes are a powerful thing. When you feel threatened, your body moves before your brain can catch up. But look at them." I turned my head back toward the mother. She had managed to get her son into a sitting position. She was wiping his face with a tissue, her own face still wet with tears. She looked exhausted. She looked like a woman who had spent 20-odd years trying to navigate a world that wasn't built for her son, and today, that world had pushed back. The anger I had felt toward her, the "why do you bring him out?" thought, suddenly felt incredibly cruel. Where else was she supposed to take him? Was he supposed to live in a cage because he might have a bad reaction to a dog? But at the same time, the memory of his boot coming down toward Daisy's head flashed in my mind, and the protective fire flared up again. It was a localized war inside my head. "I think you should go back and talk to her," the woman suggested quietly. "Not to argue, just to close the loop." I nodded, feeling a sense of dread. I didn't want to go back. I wanted to get in my car, drive back to my lonely apartment, and pretend the last 10 minutes had never happened. But I knew I couldn't. I walked back over, slowly. The woman who had helped me stayed a few feet back, a silent observer and a stabilizing force. As I approached, the mother looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked smaller than she had 10 minutes ago. "I'm sorry," I said. The words felt heavy in my mouth. "I'm so sorry that I kicked him. It was a reflex. I was scared for my dog, and I was scared for myself." The mother's lip trembled. She looked at her son, who was now just staring at the grass, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve as if nothing had happened. The storm had passed for him, but the wreckage remained for the rest of us. "I'm sorry too," she said, her voice a mere whisper. He loves dogs, usually. I don't know what happened. Maybe it was the way the sun hit her collar, or the way she licked him. Sometimes things just overload for him. I should have been more careful. I shouldn't have let him get so close." She started to cry again. But this time it wasn't the sharp cry of shock. It was the quiet, weary sob of a parent who is simply overwhelmed. "I'm not calling the police," I told her, wanting to take that weight off her shoulders at least. I was amped up. "I'm sorry I said that." We stood there for a moment in a very awkward, very painful silence. There were no more words that could fix the situation. The air between us was thick with the reality of what had happened. A collision of two different worlds, both trying to protect something they loved, and both failing to do it perfectly. "We're going to go home now," the mother said, slowly helping her son to his feet. He stood up, brushed his pants off, and looked at me. There was no malice in his eyes. There was nothing. It was like the attack had never occurred. He looked at Daisy, then looked away, and began to walk toward the parking lot with his mother holding his arm tightly. I watched them go. The woman who had intervened gave me a small, sad nod and went back to her own walk. I was left standing in the middle of the beautiful Redmond Park, the pale sunlight still filtering through the trees, but the watercolour painting had been ruined. I walked back to my car, my heart finally starting to slow down. I buckled Daisy into her doggy car seat, and she immediately curled up and fell asleep, exhausted by the stress of the encounter. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the dashboard, my hands still gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I felt like I had survived a fight, but I didn't feel like a winner. I felt dirty. I felt confused. And I knew that when I told this story to my friends later, the real trouble was only just beginning. The drive back from Redmond was a blur of grey asphalt and evergreen trees that seemed to press in on the car. Seattle's famous mist had returned, coating the windshield in a fine, shimmering layer of moisture that the wipers swished away with a rhythmic, hypnotic thwack thwack. Usually, I find that sound soothing. Today, it sounded like a countdown. Daisy was out cold in the back seat. To look at her, you'd never know that 10 minutes ago, she was a hair's breadth away from being crushed under a heavy boot. She was twitching slightly in her sleep, her paws paddling against the upholstery as she chased squirrels in a dream world where everyone was kind and every hand held a treat. I envied her. I envied her ability to move on, to reset her internal clock to zero the moment the threat was gone. I couldn't reset. My mind was a broken record, replaying those 3 seconds over and over again. The stomp, the scream, the run, the kick. The kick. Every time I visualized it, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot down my leg. I could still feel the resistance of his chest against the sole of my shoe. It wasn't a violent strike in my memory, not like a punch or a shove meant to hurt, but it was a definitive act of force. And in the quiet of my car, away from the chaos and the adrenaline, that act felt monstrous. I'm 6'1", I weigh 200 pounds. I've spent time in gyms, I know how to move my body. He was smaller than me, he was vulnerable, but he was attacking, I whispered to the empty car. He was charging. My own voice sounded thin and unconvincing. I was arguing with a phantom jury in my head, and I was losing. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, the silence of the building felt heavier than usual. I walked Daisy up the stairs, my eyes scanning the hallways as if another threat might jump out from behind a door. Once inside, I locked the deadbolt, leaned my back against the wood, and just breathed for a full minute. I needed to talk to someone. I needed a sanity check. I needed someone to tell me that I wasn't the bad guy. I grabbed my phone and called one of my oldest friends back home, Mark. Mark is the kind of guy who doesn't sugarcoat things. He's practical, grounded, and fiercely loyal. He answered on the second ring. "Hey man, how's the Emerald City treating you?" Mark's voice was a burst of sunshine I desperately needed. "Not great, Mark," I said, pacing the length of my small living room. I think I just got into a fight at a park." "A fight? You? Who do you fight? A tech bro over a parking spot?" "No," I said, my voice dropping. "It was a guy with special needs." The line went silent for a heartbeat. "Wait, what? Start from the beginning." I told him everything. I told him about the beautiful day, the friendly mother, the sudden "ew," and the attempted stomp on Daisy. I described the way the young man ran at me, that weird, fast, unsettling charge, and how I just reacted. I told him about the push kick, the crying, and the mother's look of absolute betrayal. "Whoa," Mark said when I finally stopped to catch my breath. "Okay, first of all, is Daisy okay?" "Yeah, she's fine. She's sleeping." "And are you okay? Did he hit you?" "No, I kicked him before he could get to me." "Then you did the right thing," Mark said, his tone shifting into something firm and certain. "Listen to me. It doesn't matter if he has special needs or if he's a professional MMA fighter. If someone charges at you after trying to hurt your dog, you defend yourself. You didn't hunt him down. You didn't beat him while he was down. You used the minimum amount of force to stop the threat. You pushed him back. That's it." "But Mark, he was crying. He looked like a kid. I felt like a bully." "He might have felt like a kid to you, but a 200-pound man, regardless of his mental state, is a physical threat. If you hadn't kicked him, what would have happened? He would have tackled you, grabbed Daisy, smashed your face in? You don't know. You can't take that chance." I wanted to believe him. I really did. His words felt like a shield protecting me from my own guilt. But as soon as we hung up, The shield started to crumble. I decided to call another friend, Sarah. Sarah is a social worker, someone with a heart the size of a planet and a deep understanding of human behavior. I thought she might give me a different perspective, maybe some insight into why he reacted that way. I went through the story again. This time, as I told it, I found myself focusing more on the mother's face and the son's sobbing. By the time I finished, my voice was shaking. There was a long pause on Sarah's end. I could hear her shifting in her chair. "Oh, wow," she said softly. "That sounds incredibly traumatic for everyone." "It was," I agreed. "I feel terrible. Honestly," Sarah's voice took on a cautious, almost clinical edge. "I can see why you were scared, but you never hit someone with special needs. You just don't." The words felt like a slap. "I didn't hit him, Sarah. I kicked him away from me because he was charging." "But you're a big guy," she said. "You could have just stepped aside or held your arms out. To someone in his position, a kick is a massive escalation. It's a violent act. His brain doesn't process threat and consequence the way yours does. He was probably overwhelmed, maybe by the dog's lick or the noise of the park, and he had a meltdown. He wasn't attacking you in his mind. He was reacting to a sensory overload." "That doesn't make it less dangerous for me or Daisy." I felt the heat of frustration rising in my chest. "I know," Sarah said, her voice remaining frustratingly calm. "But as the person with the, let's say, full capacity, the burden is on you to de-escalate without violence. Think about that mother. Think about how hard her life already is, and then she has to watch a stranger kick her son in the chest. That's a memory that will haunt her forever." I ended the call shortly after that. I felt worse than I had before I picked up the phone. Over the next few hours, I reached out to a few more people. A couple of guys from my old gym, a female cousin I'm close with. And that's when I noticed the pattern. It was a total gender split. Every single man I talked to had the same reaction as Mark. They focused on the mechanics of the situation. A threat emerged, a defensive move was made, the threat was neutralized, no permanent damage was done. Justified. They saw me as a protector who had been put in an impossible situation. Every single woman I talked to, however, had some variation of Sarah's reaction. They focused on the vulnerability of the young man. They talked about empathy, about the mother's pain, and about the unspoken rule that you simply do not use force against someone who isn't playing with a full deck. They saw me as an aggressor who had failed a moral test of restraint. The split in perspectives made me feel like I was losing my mind. It was as if I were looking at a duck-rabbit optical illusion. If I looked at it one way, I was a hero protecting my dog. If I looked at it the other way, I was a brute who had kicked a disabled man. I walked over to the window and looked out at the Seattle skyline. The lights were beginning to twinkle through the rain, cold and distant. I had moved here for a fresh start, to find a community where I felt safe and welcome. Instead, I felt like an outcast in my own skin. I looked back at Daisy. She had woken up and was sitting on the rug, staring at me with her head tilted. She let out a small, soft woof and trotted over, leaning her weight against my shins. I knelt down and buried my face in her fur. She smelled like the park, like grass and damp earth and home. "I did it for you," I whispered. "I do it again for you." But as the words left my lips, I realized I wasn't sure if that was true. If I could go back to that moment, to that split second when he started his Naruto run toward me, would I choose to stand my ground and let him hit me? Would I risk Daisy's life just to keep my conscience clean? Or would I still feel that instinctual, primal need to lash out? The worst part wasn't the kick itself. The worst part was the realization that I didn't know who I really was anymore. Was I the kind of man the guys saw, or the monster the women feared? I stayed in my apartment for the rest of the weekend. I didn't go back to the park. I didn't even go to the grocery store. I just sat in the quiet, watching the rain, waiting for the feeling of being a bad person to wash away. It hasn't washed away yet. The following Monday, I woke up to the sound of rain hammering against my bedroom window. It wasn't the gentle, poetic mist of the weekend. It was a heavy, relentless downpour that turned the world outside into a blurred, grey mess. For the first time since moving to Seattle, I didn't want to get out of bed. I didn't want to face the city. I didn't want to be the version of myself that existed in that park in Redmond. Daisy was already awake, sitting by the bed and staring at me with that expectant, tail-thumping energy that usually makes me smile. But today, looking at her felt different. I saw her soft ears and her trusting eyes, and all I could think about was the heavy boot of that young man swinging toward her ribs. I saw the image of her yelping in pain, broken and bleeding on the grass. And then, like a jagged piece of glass cutting through the memory, I saw my own leg lash out. I saw him fall. I heard him cry. The cycle of guilt and justification started all over again before I'd even had my first cup of coffee. I spent the workday in a daze. I work in data analysis, a job that usually requires a cold, logical focus. But the numbers on the screen kept blurring into the shape of a mother's face. I found myself staring at the cursor blinking in an empty spreadsheet, wondering if that woman was okay. Was her son bruised? Was he traumatized? Did he now have a fear of dogs, or worse, a fear of men who looked like me? During my lunch break, I made the mistake of checking my phone. I had a few missed texts from the friends I talked to over the weekend. The gender split I'd noticed wasn't just a fleeting observation. It was a widening chasm. One of my buddies, Mike, had sent a follow-up. "Hey man, don't let those girls get in your head. You're a dog dad. You protected your pack. If some guy, I don't care who he is, charges at me and my dog, he's getting a lot more than a push kick. You were a gentleman about it, honestly." I wanted to believe Mike. His perspective felt like a warm blanket. It made the world feel simple again. Predator and prey, threat and defense. It was a lizard brain logic that felt safe. But then, there was a message from my sister Clara. I'd called her late Sunday night, hoping for the kind of unconditional support siblings usually provide. Instead, she'd been quiet for a long time before saying, "I love you, but I'm struggling with this one. I keep thinking about if that was our cousin or someone we knew. He doesn't have the tools to understand why you hit him. To him, you're just a giant who hurt him for no reason. I know you were scared, but you have to be better than your fear. Be better than your fear." The words echoed in my head, mocking me. How do you be better when a 200-pound man is sprinting at you with a look of pure, unhinged aggression? How do you maintain moral superiority when your dog is seconds away from being stomped? I felt like I was being judged by people who had never stood in the middle of a park, holding a trembling animal, facing a threat they couldn't reason with. By Tuesday, the isolation was starting to get to me. I had moved to Seattle to start a new life, but I was living like a hermit. I was avoiding the very parks I had been so excited to explore. Every time I looked at a map of the city, I saw Redmond as a no-go zone, a place where I had left a piece of my humanity behind. I decided I couldn't stay locked up forever. Daisy needed to run. I needed to breathe. I decided to take her to our local park, the small, unremarkable patch of grass just 3 blocks from my apartment. It wasn't the scenic, sprawling beauty of Redmond. It was just a fenced-in dog run with a few benches and a trash can. But it felt safe. It was predictable. As we walked toward the park, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. I was scanning the perimeter. I was looking at every person we passed, gauging their distance, analysing their gait, searching for any sign of unpredictability. My hand gripped the leash so tightly that my palm began to sweat despite the cold. I was no longer a guy taking his dog for a walk. I was a soldier on patrol. When we got to the dog run, there were a few other owners there. A woman with a golden retriever, an older man with a pug. They were chatting, laughing, their dogs playing in the mud. It was the most normal scene imaginable. I let Daisy off her leash. She immediately bolted toward the golden, her tail a blur of motion. I watched her, waiting for the relief to hit me. I waited for that feeling of, this is where I belong, to return. But it didn't. I sat on a cold metal bench, my eyes darting toward the entrance every time the gate clicked. Every time a new person walked in, my heart rate spiked. I found myself watching the way people interacted with their dogs. If a dog barked too loudly, I flinched. If a person moved too quickly, I tensed up. I realized then that the incident hadn't just changed the way I saw that young man or his mother. It had changed the way I saw the world. It had introduced a new, terrifying variable into my life. The idea that at any moment, a peaceful afternoon could turn into a violent confrontation that would leave me questioning my own soul. The woman with the golden retriever walked over to me, her dog trotting happily at her side. "She's a sweetheart," the woman said, nodding toward Daisy. "How old is she?" I looked at her, and for a split second I felt a wave of suspicion. Who was she? Was she going to ask to pet Daisy? If she did, and Daisy licked her, would she get angry? Would she scream? I caught myself and took a breath. "She's 5, I said, my voice sounding strained. "Her name is Daisy." "She's got a lot of energy," the woman laughed. "We come here every Tuesday. It's the only way to tire this one out." She was being perfectly kind. She was being a normal human being. But all I could think about was the mother in Redmond. She had been kind too. She had been grandmotherly. She had been soft-spoken. And 10 minutes later she was screaming in a park while her son tried to attack us. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be normal yet. "Yeah, she's great," I said, standing up abruptly. I think we've had enough for today, though. We've got to get going." I whistled for Daisy. She looked at me, confused, her face covered in mud and a look of pure disappointment in her eyes. She didn't want to leave. She was having fun. But I couldn't stay. The open space felt like a trap. The strangers felt like threats. I clipped her leash on and practically marched her out of the park. Back in the apartment, I sat on the floor with her. I grabbed a towel and started wiping the mud off her paws. She licked my hand, a warm, wet gesture of forgiveness for cutting her playtime short. "I don't know what to do, Daisy," I whispered. I felt like I was waiting for something. An apology from the universe? A sign that I wasn't a bad person? Or maybe I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for a knock on the door, a police officer with a warrant, a lawsuit, a viral video that I didn't know existed. The internet is a small place. People film everything. What if someone had their phone out in Redmond? What if there was a video titled "Man Attacks Special Needs Youth in Park" circulating right now? The thought made me feel physically sick. In today's world, context doesn't matter as much as the image. And the image of me, a large man kicking a crying, disabled person, that was an image that could destroy a life. I spent the next 2 hours scouring social media, searching for keywords like Redmond Park, incident, and dog attack. I scrolled through local neighborhood groups, my heart in my throat. I found nothing. No videos, no angry posts, no mentions of a crazy guy with a spaniel. The silence was almost worse. It meant the incident only existed in the minds of the people who were there. It existed in that mother's memory. It existed in that young man's body. And it existed in mine. I thought about the gender split again. I thought about why the women in my life were so much more critical of my actions. Was it because they were more empathetic? Or was it because they knew what it was like to be the smaller person in a confrontation? They knew the fear of a larger, stronger force. To them, I wasn't the victim. I was the force. But then I thought about the men. They knew the burden of protection. They knew that when things go sideways, no one is coming to save you. You are the only thing standing between the world and the things you love. I was stuck in the middle. A man who had done what he felt he had to do, but hated the man he had to be to do it. Wednesday came with a break in the weather. A fragile, pale blue sky that seemed almost too bright after days of gloom. I decided I couldn't keep living like a fugitive in my own apartment. I needed to find a way to exist in the world again, even if that world felt a little more jagged than it had a week ago. I decided to take Daisy to a different park, one I'd seen online called Marymore. It was huge, famous for its off-leash areas, and I figured the sheer scale of the place would make me feel less trapped. As I drove, I found myself rehearsing what I'd do if something happened again. If a dog rushes us, I'll just pick her up and walk away. If a person acts strange, I'll cross the street immediately. No more standing my ground, no more what-if scenarios. I was trying to build a cage of rules around myself, a way to guarantee that I'd never have to use force again. Marymore was bustling. Dozens of dogs were sprinting through the tall grass, their owners trailing behind with tennis ball launchers and coffee cups. For a few minutes, the atmosphere worked its magic. Daisy was having the time of her life, her long ears flopping as she bounded through the meadows. I felt a tiny spark of the old joy, the simple pleasure of being a guy and his dog on a sunny afternoon. But then, I saw him. Near a cluster of picnic tables, there was a group of young adults. They were laughing, talking loudly, and among them was a young man who moved with that same stiff, slightly uncoordinated gait I'd seen in Redmond. He had headphones on and was rocking back and forth as he watched the dogs run by. My breath hitched. My heart, which had finally settled into a normal rhythm, began to thud against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't even realize I was doing it, but I had shortened Daisy's leash until she was walking right against my leg. I was staring at the group, my eyes narrowed, my body tensing for a fight that hadn't even started. One of the people in the group, a girl around my age, noticed me staring. She gave me a friendly wave and a smile. I didn't wave back. I just turned and walked in the opposite direction, my pace quickening until I was almost jogging. I was halfway across the field before I realized what I was doing. I was profiling. I was looking at a group of people having a nice day and seeing a threat because one of them reminded me of the worst 3 minutes of my life. I felt a wave of shame so hot it made my face sting. Is this who I am now? I wondered. Am I the guy who sees a disability and sees a danger? I sat down on a fallen log, far away from the picnic tables, and let Daisy sniff around the base of a cedar tree. I pulled out my phone and looked at the call log. I hadn't spoken to Sarah since our conversation on Sunday. Her words, "You have to be better than your fear," were still sitting in the back of my mind like a lead weight. I decided to text her. "Hey, I'm at the park. Saw someone who reminded me of the guy from Redmond. I panicked and ran. I feel like a jerk." She replied almost instantly. "You're not a jerk. You're traumatized. It's okay to feel scared, but don't let it turn into a prejudice." The guy in Redmond wasn't every special needs person. He was one individual in a high-stress moment. I stared at the screen. "I know that intellectually," I typed back, "but my body doesn't know it. My body thinks everyone is a threat." "Then keep going to the park," she wrote. "Don't let the fear win. And maybe try to remember that the mother was scared too." I put the phone away and looked out at the field. I saw a man throwing a frisbee for a border collie. I saw a couple holding hands. I saw life happening all around me, messy and unpredictable and beautiful. I realized then that the gender split among my friends wasn't about who was right and who was wrong. It was about two different, equally valid fears. The men in my life feared the loss of safety, the idea that they could be attacked and have their hands tied by social norms. They feared being the victim who didn't fight back. The women feared the misuse of power, the idea that strength could be used against the vulnerable without empathy. They feared the aggressor who doesn't know when to stop. I was the intersection of those two fears. I had used power to protect safety. I had been both the shield and the sword. I spent another hour at Marymore, forcing myself to stay even when my anxiety nudged me to leave. I watched the group at the picnic tables from a distance. They were just having lunch. The young man with the headphones eventually got up and started dancing a little bit to whatever music he was listening to. His friends cheered him on. It was a moment of pure, harmless humanity. I felt a small piece of the tension in my shoulders dissolve. On the drive home, I didn't replay the kick. Instead, I thought about the mother's face when we parted ways. She had apologized. I had apologized. In the end, we were just two people caught in a storm, both of us wet and shivering and trying to find our way home. I haven't been back to the park in Redmond. I don't know if I ever will. Some places hold too much ghost static, too many echoes of a version of yourself you don't like. But I'm still taking Daisy out. I'm still looking for those watercolour sunsets. I've learned that life in a new city isn't just about finding the right coffee shop or the best hiking trail. It's about navigating the grey areas of your own character. It's about realising that you can be the hero of your dog's story and a villain in someone else's, all in the span of 60 seconds. I look down at Daisy, who's currently sprawled across my feet, snoring softly. She doesn't judge me. She doesn't care about gender splits or moral philosophy. She just knows that when the world got loud and scary, I was there. And maybe, for now, that has to be enough. But I want to ask you, the people listening to this, what would you have done if you were standing there with your dog and someone charged at you with that kind of intensity? Where do you draw the line? Is there ever a right way to handle a situation where there are no winners? The world isn't black and white. It's a lot like Seattle, mostly grey, often damp, and full of people just trying to get through the day without anyone getting hurt. I'm still figuring out my place in it, but I know one thing for sure. I'm going to keep walking Daisy, because as long as she's by my side, I have a reason to keep trying to be the man she thinks I am. If you've ever been in a situation where your instincts and your morals went to war, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. How do you handle that kind of guilt? And if you want to hear more stories about the complicated, messy reality of being human, make sure to subscribe. We're all just trying to find our way through